Hello everyone, this is Joe, and thanks for coming back for another video. After I did the Jetson Bolt Pro external battery video, a lot of folks contacted me and wanted to know if there was a way they could do the external battery modification to their Jetson Bolt Pro without having to use a soldering iron. And the answer is yes, you can. So in this video, I'm going to show you various ways that you can do the external battery modification without having to do any soldering whatsoever. Let's get started. One of the ways that you can purchase connectors is they come pre-soldered with leads on each end. So if you notice here, this is an XT60 connector, and there's a black and a red lead, and it's been heat shrunk. It has insulation on the wire. It's been tinned, and it's been pre-trimmed, so you have some wire extending from the edges of the wire. So we have a female and a male connector. Same thing with the Dean's connector. Here's the Dean's connector, and it comes pre-soldered with leads attached, heat shrunk, and the ends of the wires tinned with solder, and they've also been stripped a little bit, and all you have to do is use various types of crimping tools and different types of connectors to crimp these connectors onto the leads. So let me show you how you can do that. So let's talk a little bit about wire sizes and different types of connectors for those wire sizes. These are crimp-on connectors, and these are what I call spade connectors. If you look the blue, this is a female, and here's the little spade portion. This is the male side. Notice there's red, blue, and sort of a yellowish white. If you look on the outside, you notice there's a range of wire gauge. AWG stands for American Wire Gauge. There's also a British wire gauge if you happen to be in the UK. Wire gauge, I have another video out that talks about various sizes of wires. I'll put a link in the description. It goes into much greater detail about wire gauge size and amperage requirements. For the Jetson Bolt Pro, we use 14 gauge wire, so I'm going to talk in this video about 14 gauge wire. Notice there is 16 to 14 wire gauge. The color is blue. So in this case, we're going to be using blue connectors for 14 gauge wire. There's another type of connector. These connectors are rather new. I've never used these before, but I've seen some videos. What it is this connector is a piece of heat shrink tubing, and it has some hot glue sections on the ends. Those are the blue pieces. In the center is a very low melting point solder alloy. You can use a heat gun to melt that solder. You put each end in the wire, and the heat shrink shrinks around the wire, the solder melts, and joins a fairly decent connection of the joints of the wire. So I'm going to show you how to do all these different types of connectors and how to crimp them and or use the heat gun to form a decent soldering joint between two sections of wire or sections of connectors to wires. Let's get started. First off, let's take a look at these are temporary connections that you can connect and reconnect. This is called a bullet connector. The reason why is the male end looks like a little bullet. There's a male end and there's a female end. You can connect these two, and then later if you want to, let's say, remove a portion, either the battery pack or get to the controller or something, it's very easy just to disconnect the bullet connector, and now you can separate the component on either side of the wire connection. Okay, we already talked about the spade connector, a female end and a male end. These are also a temporary connector. You can connect them, disconnect them, and reconnect them. These are crimped on. The bullet connectors are also crimped on. The other connector we're going to talk about is referred to as the butt connector. You stick a wire in each end and you crimp down on each side with a pair of crimpers, and now you have a permanent bond between pieces of wire. In order to separate this, you have to cut the wires at each end. On the heat shrink connector, you need to have yourself a heat gun, and I'm going to show you how to use the heat gun. Other than that, you're going to need a pair of what are called side cutters, and get yourself some nice tools. Don't buy cheap crap. You want really nice tools. They'll last a long time. The blades are hardened and they won't wear out. If you buy a set of cheap import tools, the blades are not hardened and they'll get dull really quickly. Same thing goes for wire strippers. I'll show you how to use these. These you can pick up at your local big box store like Lowe's or Home Depot. You're going to pay a little bit more, but they're going to last longer and they're going to do a better job. One of the last tools we need is a set of crimpers, and you can pick these up. These are commercial electric. Again, big box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's will carry these. These are really, really good, and they crimp the connectors on very tightly. Don't buy yourself a pair of these. These, in my opinion, are crap. They don't work very well. So they're really nicely labeled and they're color coded, but I just find you can't get enough leverage to do a decent job crimping, and sometimes it will actually bend the connector you're trying to crimp, and then you'll end up having to cut the wires off and do it again. So get yourself a decent set of tools. So first off, you're going to want to cut some wires, and I've already pre-cut these, but just to show you, I'll cut one end off. Nice sound on a good pair of side cutters. Really nice. Okay. Once you cut all your wires to size, you're going to want to strip the ends of the wire. This wire stripper here has a little lever that comes down. If you'll notice, this left part comes down and holds the wire against a little segregated portion here, and then as you squeeze, there's a set of blades here with different holes, and these holes are labeled with different wire gauges. Okay, so as you see, you put the wire in and you squeeze and it strips the end of the wire. Let me show you how that works. This is 14 gauge. If we look on the teeth here, you'll notice it will say 16, 14, 12, 8 and 10, 18, 22, and 20. So the various size holes on this blade portion of the strippers match the size of wire you want to strip. In a lot of cases, if you look at the wire in very small writing on the wire, it will tell you what the wire gauge size is. It isn't always the case, but in a lot of cases it is. So in this case, this is 14 gauge. We want to use the second hole from the left. So we open that up. Let me open this up. I'll show you from the side. You notice as we squeeze, the little pincher grabs onto the left end of the wire. As we squeeze now, the levers come apart, pull off the insulation, and now you're left with a stripped end of a wire. Same thing on the other side. We come in, we're using the second hole. I used the wrong sized hole. That's okay, just do it again. And you notice we now have both ends of this wire stripped. So I'm going to go through now and strip all the wires. I'll do the rest off camera, and then we'll come back and show you how to do crimping. We're going to start out with the connectors that you need to crimp. And again, you need to purchase yourself a really good pair of crimpers. I've used some cheap crimpers in the past, and they destroy the connectors. They don't make a good connection. You can pull the wires out of the connectors. You really want a strong pair of crimpers. If you look at this pair here, you'll notice there's a little V right here, which is your female portion of the crimper. Then you have a little tab, which is also in the shape of a little V, upside down V. And as you crimp, that male portion comes in and pinches the connector in the upside down V. Okay, if you look at each type of connector that crimps, inside there's a little piece of metal right here that gets pinched down onto the wire and squeezes the wire between the two pieces of metal. So you want a really strong crimp. If you use the cheap crimpers, it won't crimp very well. You can then pull the wires out of the connector, or it will damage during the crimping and it will crack the metal and won't perform a good crimp. So always get yourself a good pair of crimpers. It will save you a lot of headaches if you're crimping wire. So let's go ahead and show you how this works. I like to take the ends of the wire and twist them so I won't get any little frayed. See how the wire frays? You don't want that. You want to twist your wire so there's no frayed wires on the end. You want to take and insert the wire into the tube. Look on the inside. I like to take and stick just a teeny bit of the wire out past the circular portion of the metal here. I want to hang on to that. Take and put, in this case, there's a little indentation in the plastic, and that's where you want to crimp. We're going to come in, we're going to make sure that tooth, if you will, is right there, and then we want to squeeze. I like to start it and then take both hands and squeeze really hard. And when you put it out, notice there's a little notch in the wire connector, and that actually takes that metal and pinches it up against the wire on the inside of the connector, and now it's not coming loose. This is a good crimp. This type of crimper does not do that type of a crimp, so you don't know if you're going to get the metal to metal connection inside the crimper. Okay, so that's one side. Again, twist your wires. You don't want any wires coming apart inside. Then take that, insert it in. I like to look inside and make sure that I have a little bit of wire sticking out that round tube. And again, hold both with your fingers. And then make sure your little tip is in the V, and then again you want to start squeezing. Take both hands and squeeze really hard, and you can tell you've gone far enough by looking at the little indentation where it's pressed and squeezed the two pieces of metal together. That's a good crimp. Now when you join your connections, you have a male and a female. You can now make a connection. Nice thing about this type of connection is it's temporary. You can pull it apart and then you can remove and replace the component on either side of the connector. Okay, so I like these connectors. As you see, they're insulated and they are really firm, but they're not necessarily waterproof inside, so moisture could get in there, But in most applications, and especially on your e-bike, I don't think you're going to have to worry too much about water. But again, that's one type of connector, and now we have a nice 2 pieces of wire connected with a connector. Let's now do the bullet connector. Bullet connector works the exact same way. Notice the little indentation on either side. If you look at the end and look down in there, again, there's your piece of cylindrical metal. You stick your wire in and you crimp it there. Same on the male or bullet side of the connector. So let's get 2 pieces of wire. Let's put the male end on first. In this case, you can push it in till it stops. Hold it with your fingers. Make sure you put the tip inside put the wire inside the V and the connector inside the V. Make sure your little tip is now against that connector. You want to squeeze, and then both hands squeeze hard. Notice we have our little indentation. We have a good connector. Same thing on the female side. Come in, push the wire in the connector till it stops. Line up your V and your tip. Squeeze. Both hands squeeze hard. And again, see the indentation? We have a really nice crimp. And now we can join or disconnect the bullet connector. The third type of crimp-on connector we have is the butt joint. And you notice there's a little hollow section of metal on each end. And in the case of a butt connector, these are permanent. You put your one connector in, or one wire in the connector on one side. Again, hold it. Get your crimpers. Line up the V and the sharp tip. Squeeze. Notice the indentation. Again, now we have a nice crimped connector on one side of the butt connector. We can now come in, twist our wires. We can now come in and insert the wire on the other side of the butt connector. Again, get your V, squeeze, both hands squeeze. Notice your indentation. And again, now we have a really strong crimp. Now again, this is permanent. The only way to get this off is to cut each side and cut the butt connector out, and then you'll have to use another type of connector if you want to again rejoin these wires. So that's the crimp-on connectors and the different styles that you have. They work really well. As long as you have a good crimper, you won't have a problem with these coming apart. Not as good as solder, but it's just about as well. Now let's take a look. I have never used this before, but I've seen videos of other people using it, and it looks pretty nice. So in this case, we're not going to use crimpers. We're going to take our wires, and it's very similar to a butt connector. We're going to insert the 2 wires in on each side. And we're going to sort of smush the 2 wire ends together. Okay. Now, we're going to get our heat gun. We're going to turn our heat gun on here. And just like we were using heat shrink, oops, and that slipped a little bit. Let's push this back. You want to make sure both ends of the bare wire are under, and you want to get that. Don't want to burn your fingers either. You notice the heat shrink is starting to grab on to the wire and shrink down. Let me move my fingers so I won't burn them here. As you can see now, the heat shrink is coming down. The hot glue is melting. That will seal the wire and supposedly make it watertight. Now what I'm going to do is turn my heat range up all the way. And now we're going to try to melt that solder. If you look really close, you can start seeing that solder become smaller and smaller. It's now starting to melt around the wire. I'm going to keep on holding it here until we get it really well melted. Now, there's the finished joint. It feels pretty strong. As you notice, if you were doing a lot of crimping, I don't know if I'd want to do this. It took a lot longer to crimp this. It was a little finicky getting the wires in, the bare portions of the wire, into that solder area. It wasn't until the heat shrink started to shrink down and grab onto the wire that I was able to not worry about the wire slipping out. But it did eventually melt down. The solder melted down around the wire. The heat shrink and the hot glue melted, forming a looks like a pretty nice waterproof bond. But if I was having to do a lot of crimping, I don't know if I'd want to use that. I would probably use one of the other types. But this looks pretty nice. Okay, it's now heat shrunk all the way around. It is waterproof. The solder did melt. Actually, let's do an experiment here. Let's take our snips and let's cut this. And let's pull this off and see. Okay, the solder did not melt all the way through into the wires, but it did flow around the surface of the wires. So again, it's not as good as soldering. Let's see if I can snip some of this, and we'll remove it. And notice it did melt. The solder did melt onto the surface of the wire, but it did not penetrate. But again, it looks like a pretty nice bond. The solder did grab on and melt around the surface of the wire. Between the heat shrink and the hot glue, it really formed a nice waterproof bond. So you have to give that credit. It did take a bit longer to get these two wires connected, but I think the connection is pretty good. So again, here's a different variety of different ways of connecting wire without having to use a soldering iron. And you're able, in several cases, you're able to have a temporary connection where you can disconnect and reconnect your wires. The other two, the melt-on and the butt connector, are permanent. In order to get these out, you're going to have to cut them out. Here's several different scenarios that you can use to add an external battery to your Jetson Bolt Pro without having to do any soldering whatsoever. So hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.